Rain hit the window of the cleaning closet where Adaeze counted her tips for the third time that night, hoping the number would change. It never did. $300. Her mother's chemotherapy bill was due in 6 days, and $300 would not save anyone. She folded the bills into her pocket and told herself tomorrow would be different, the way she had told herself every night for the past 4 months, and the way she had stopped fully believing somewhere around the second month. The hospital did not accept promises. It accepted numbers, and her numbers were always short. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and reached for her cart, because crying in a cleaning closet had never once paid a single bill, and she did not intend to start believing it would tonight. "Miss Adaeze." The head housekeeper's voice cut through the silence of the hallway with an urgency that made Adaeze's stomach drop before a single word was fully spoken. "Mr. Whitfield wants his suite cleaned personally. Tonight." The name landed in the small closet like a stone dropped into still water, and every part of Adaeze's body went cold at once. Everyone in the hotel knew the name Whitfield. Men lost jobs for looking at him wrong. Women who cleaned his suite came out either wealthier or in tears, and nobody ever said which one to expect, because the staff who knew the difference had long since stopped talking about it in the open, as though the walls themselves might report the wrong word to the wrong man. She knocked on his door at 11 that night, telling herself she only needed 10 minutes and a paycheck, and that 10 minutes was a short enough window for even the worst rumors to prove untrue. She did not know that in 6 days, that man would sign a contract with her name on it, that a single signature would rearrange the entire architecture of her life, and that the version of dignity she carried into that room would be tested in ways she had never once imagined possible. She only knew, standing in the hallway with her cart and her master key, that she was tired in a way sleep no longer fixed, and that tired people made choices they would spend years trying to understand. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The Whitfield Grand occupied an entire city block, and the man whose name sat above its doors occupied a floor all his own, a floor most employees were never permitted to see except through the security footage reviewed each morning by men who reported directly to him. Adaeze had worked there for 2 years without ever seeing him in person, though his presence had shaped nearly every rule she followed, every uniform she wore, every shift she was assigned without explanation. She had heard his voice through phones held by frightened managers who repeated his instructions word for word, afraid to paraphrase a single syllable. She had seen his photograph on the lobby wall, unsmiling, arms folded, eyes fixed somewhere past the camera as though the person taking the picture did not deserve his full attention. And she had built, without meaning to, an entire private mythology around a man she had never actually met. Everyone said the same thing about Marcus Whitfield. He built one of the largest hospitality companies on the East Coast from almost nothing after his father's sudden death, and in doing so, he had forgotten how to be gentle with anyone, including himself. The staff whispered that grief had hardened him into something closer to stone than man, that he walked through his own hotels like a stranger auditing a life he no longer fully wanted. Some said he had not smiled since the funeral. Others said he had never smiled at all, not even before, and that the funeral had simply given the rumor a convenient beginning. Adaeze had learned, long before that night, to keep her head down whenever his name entered a conversation, because names like his had a way of finding the people who spoke them carelessly. She pushed her cart down the 40th floor hallway and stopped outside Suite 4001, the heaviest door on the entire corridor, dark wood with brass fittings that gleamed even under dim lighting, as though the suite itself understood it belonged to someone who expected to be noticed even in its smallest details. She knocked twice and waited, counting the seconds in her head the way she counted everything lately, out of a habit that had stopped feeling like anxiety and started feeling like survival. When no one answered, she used her master key and stepped inside, calling out softly to announce herself the way she had been trained to do, her voice smaller in that enormous room than she expected it to sound. The suite was larger than the apartment she shared with her mother, larger than any space she had ever been permitted to stand inside without feeling like an intruder. Floor to ceiling, windows looked out over a city glittering with a million lights that did not care whether anyone below them was struggling, indifferent in the particular way only wealth and altitude could manage together. A bottle of whiskey sat open on the counter, 3 fingers gone from it, the glass beside it still faintly warm to the touch when her hand brushed it while wiping down the surface. Adaeze set her cart by the door and began her work quietly, hopping to finish before he returned from wherever he had gone, telling herself that quiet, careful work was the safest kind of work a person in her position could offer a man like him. She was folding towels in the bathroom when she heard the door open, and her hands went still before her mind had fully processed the sound. Footsteps moved through the suite, unhurried, heavy, with the particular weight of a man who had never once had to knock before entering a room he already owned. She stepped out of the bathroom, towel still clutched in her hands, and found herself looking directly into the eyes of the man from the lobby photograph. Except in person, his eyes carried something the photograph had failed entirely to capture, something closer to exhaustion than the coldness the rumors had promised her. He did not smile, he did not greet her, he simply looked at her the way people look at furniture they are deciding whether to keep, an appraisal so brief and so total that Adaeze felt it in her spine before he spoke a single word. "Who let you in here?" he said, and it was not a question, not in the way most sentences shaped like questions usually are. "Housekeeping, sir. I was told to clean the suite tonight. At this hour. I was told it was urgent." He crossed the room and poured another 2 fingers of whiskey into his glass, without offering her a seat or acknowledging that she remained standing there, holding a folded towel like a shield against a threat she could not yet name. "Leave the towels, get out." Adaeze set the towel down carefully, the way her mother had taught her to handle things that did not belong to her, and reached for the door, her pulse loud enough in her ears that she almost missed his voice stopping her before her hand touched the handle. "Wait," she turned. He was studying her now, the whiskey glass forgotten in his hand, something calculating behind his eyes that made her chest tighten with a fear that had less to do with violence and more to do with the sense that she was being measured against a scale she could not see. "How long have you worked here?" 2 years, sir. And in 2 years, no one has ever told you not to speak unless spoken to." "I apologize, sir. I only wanted to finish my work." He set the glass down on the counter with a sound too sharp for the quiet room, a small violence that made Adaeze flinch despite herself. "Everyone who works for me wants something. Tell me what you want and we can skip the part where you pretend you're only here for towels." The insult landed exactly where it was meant to land, low in her stomach, familiar in a way that made her tired rather than angry, because she had heard variations of this sentence from other men in other rooms over the years. Men who assumed a uniform meant a woman had nothing left worth protecting, nothing left to lose that mattered to anyone but herself. She thought of her mother's hospital bed, of the numbers on the bill that refused to shrink no matter how many extra shifts she worked, and she made a decision in that moment she would spend the following weeks trying to fully understand herself. "I need money," she said, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. "For my mother's treatment. If there's work you need done beyond cleaning, name it and I'll consider it." Something shifted in his face, though she could not read exactly what it meant, whether it was surprise or something closer to recognition, as though her desperation had reminded him of a version of himself he preferred not to think about in the middle of the night. He walked to his desk, pulled out a checkbook, and wrote a number that made her vision blur for a moment, a number that represented months of hospital bills condensed into a single stroke of ink. He tore the check free and held it toward her without looking at her directly, as though looking at her while extending the money would have made the gesture mean something he was not yet prepared to name. "For the towels," he said, "and for reminding me what desperation looks like up close. I'd forgotten." She did not take the check immediately. Pride, even starved and exhausted, still had teeth, and hers had not yet been fully worn down by circumstance. I don't want charity. It isn't charity. It's payment for cleaning a room I made a mess of arguing with lawyers all day. Take it or don't, but don't waste my time standing there deciding whether your dignity is worth more than your mother's life. The words cut deeper than he likely intended, and she took the check because he was right, and because being right did not make him kind, and because kindness had never once paid a hospital bill in the history of hospital bills. She left the suite that night telling herself she would never have to see Marcus Whitfield again. She was wrong, and some quiet, honest part of her had already suspected as much before she reached the elevator. 3 days later, Adaeze's supervisor called her into the small office behind the front desk, her face pale in a way that made Adaeze's stomach drop before a single word was spoken, the kind of expression reserved for news too large to soften with a gentle tone. "Mr. Whitfield asked for you by name," the supervisor said. "He wants you assigned to his suite exclusively, starting today." Adaeze's mind raced through every possible reason a man like that would request a specific housekeeper, and none of the reasons that came to her felt entirely safe, though none of them felt entirely explainable either, given the brief and strange nature of their only exchange. Did he say why? "He doesn't explain himself to me, and I don't ask. You should go up there now. He doesn't like waiting." She rode the elevator to the 40th floor with her hands folded tightly in front of her, rehearsing every polite refusal she could think of in case he asked something she could not agree to, running through scenarios that grew increasingly unlikely the closer the elevator climbed. When she knocked, the door opened before her knuckles finished the second rap, and Marcus stood there in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking less like the cold executive from the photograph and more like a man who had not slept properly in longer than he would ever admit aloud to anyone, including himself. "Come in," he said. "Sit down, I have a proposal." She sat on the edge of the leather chair he gestured toward, spine straight, ready to leave the moment the conversation crossed a line she would not cross, her body arranged for a quick exit even as her curiosity kept her seated. He remained standing, packing slightly, choosing his words with the care of a man used to negotiating deals worth more than most people's lifetimes, a habit that made even personal conversation sound faintly like contract terms. "My grandmother is turning 90 next month," he said. "She has spent the last 3 years asking why I am not married, why the family name is going to die with a man who works too much to notice anyone around him. She's ill. The doctors say her heart is weaker than she lets on. I would like to give her one thing before she goes, and that thing is a wedding." Adaeze blinked, certain she had misheard him, though the room offered no correction to what her ears had clearly registered. "Sir, I don't understand what that has to do with me. I'm offering you a contract. 6 months, married in name only, enough money to pay every hospital bill your mother will ever accumulate, and a clean exit once my grandmother's celebration has passed. No expectations beyond appearances. You keep your life, I keep mine. We simply share a surname in public." The offer sat in the air between them, absurd and enormous at once, the kind of proposal that belonged more to legend than to an actual Tuesday afternoon. Adaeze thought of the towel she had folded in his bathroom days earlier, of the check she had taken with shaking hands, of the mountain of debt that grew taller every week her mother remained in that hospital bed, unable to work, unable to promise her own recovery. She thought, too, of every warning the other staff had whispered about this man, about rooms people entered and left changed, about reputations that existed for reasons even if the reasons were never spoken aloud in full. "Why me?" she asked. "You could hire an actress, someone from your own circle who understands what she's agreeing to. Because actresses talk to reporters, and women from my circle expect this to become permanent. You have no interest in my money beyond what solves an immediate problem, and you have every reason to keep this quiet. That makes you useful in a way no one else in my life currently is." It should have insulted her more than it did. Instead, Exhaustion made the offer sound almost reasonable, the way anything sounds reasonable to a person who has run out of other options and has stopped believing better options are coming. She asked for a single day to think, and he granted it without argument, sliding a business card across the desk with a number scrawled beneath the printed one, a small gesture of trust from a man who otherwise trusted almost no one. Adaeze left the office that afternoon carrying a decision she had not yet made, and a growing, uneasy sense that whatever she chose would follow her for far longer than 6 months. Adaeze's mother, thin against the hospital pillows but sharp-eyed as ever, listened to the entire proposal without interrupting once, her expression unreadable in the way it always became whenever a decision mattered enough to require silence first. When Adaeze finished, her mother reached for her hand with fingers that had grown too light over the past year, fingers that used to braid Adaeze's hair every Sunday morning before either of them had heard the word chemotherapy. "You are not for sale," her mother said, "not even to save me. It isn't like that, it's paperwork, 6 months and then it's over. Paperwork has a way of becoming a life, my daughter. Be careful with men who think love is a line item." Adaeze carried those words with her the next morning when she returned to the 40th floor, and signed the contract Marcus's lawyer had prepared overnight, the pages thick with clauses she read twice before allowing herself to sign, a habit born less of legal caution and more of the fear that had followed her since childhood, the fear of agreeing to something she did not fully understand. The terms were exactly as he described them the day before. 6 months, a monthly payment large enough to cover every medical expense with room to spare, separate bedrooms, no physical expectations, and a clean, generous settlement waiting at the contract's end for whichever version of her walked away from it. She signed her name beneath his, and something in her chest tightened as the pen left the paper, a small, unexplainable ache that felt less like regret and more like the sensation of a door closing somewhere behind her that she had not yet decided whether she wanted to reopen. "We'll announce it at my grandmother's gathering next week," Marcus said, sliding the signed pages into a folder without ceremony, without any acknowledgement that the moment carried weight beyond its logistics. "Until then, you'll move into the penthouse. My staff will help you settle in. I have my own apartment, which you'll keep paying for out of pocket while living somewhere you don't need to worry about rent, or you can move in and save yourself the trouble. Either way, appearances need to hold from this point forward." She moved in 2 days later with a single suitcase and a photograph of her mother tucked inside her coat pocket, the only piece of home she allowed herself to bring into a life that suddenly felt borrowed rather than owned, a life measured in months rather than years, a life she had agreed to enter with her eyes fully open and her heart, she believed at the time, safely closed. What she did not yet understand, standing in the doorway of a penthouse too large for one person, and entirely too quiet for 2 strangers pretending to be married, was how quickly a closed heart could find its way back open when given enough reason to trust the person on the other side of the arrangement. Billionaire Whitfield was smaller than her portrait suggested and sharper than her age implied, a woman whose frail body seemed almost like a disguise for the force of will still burning behind her eyes. She held Adaeze's hand in both of hers the moment they were introduced at the gathering, studying her face the way a woman studies something she has waited a long time to see arrive. "So you're the one who finally caught my grandson's attention," Billionaire said. "Tell me, dear, what did you have to do to manage that?" "He hasn't looked twice at a woman since his father's funeral." Adaeze glanced at Marcus, who offered no rescue, his jaw tight in a way that suggested this question unsettled him more than he wanted to admit in front of a room full of relatives. "I suppose I wasn't trying to catch anything, ma'am. I was only doing my job." Billionaire laughed, a sound too young and too full for her frail body, a laugh that turned several heads across the room. That's exactly the kind of answer that would catch him. He spent his whole life surrounded by people trying too hard. "Come, sit beside me. Tell me about yourself while my grandson pretends he isn't listening to every word." The gathering stretched into evening, filled with relatives Adaeze had never met, and would likely never see again once the contract expired. Each one studying her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion that made her spine ache from holding herself so carefully upright through every introduction. Marcus stayed close throughout the night, his hand occasionally finding the small of her back to guide her through introductions, a gesture that felt practiced, and yet, more than once, lingered a beat longer than the performance strictly required, long enough that Adaeze found herself wondering whether the audience for that particular gesture was truly the relatives watching or something closer to himself. Near the end of the night, Billionaire pulled Adaeze aside, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so frail, her eyes carrying a weight that felt almost like a warning wrapped inside a blessing. "I don't know what arrangement the two of you have," she said quietly, "and I won't pretend I haven't wondered. But I've watched my grandson's face tonight, and I haven't seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you in longer than I care to remember. Whatever this is, don't let it end the moment it becomes inconvenient." Adaeze said nothing, unsure how to respond to a truth she was not yet ready to name even to herself, a truth that had been quietly forming somewhere beneath the surface of every careful, professional interaction she had shared with Marcus since the night she folded towels in his bathroom. She smiled instead, thanked Billionaire for her kindness, and carried the older woman's words home with her that night like a small, heavy stone she could not quite decide where to set down. The following weeks fell into an uneasy rhythm neither of them had planned, but both had quietly begun to depend on. Adaeze learned Marcus's habits the way she once memorized hospital visiting hours, adjusting her own schedule around his without meaning to, without fully noticing the shift until it had already happened. He worked late into most nights, but she began noticing small things that contradicted the cold reputation the staff had warned her about before she ever met him in person. He left a cup of tea outside her door on mornings she overslept from exhaustion, always the same blend, always still warm enough to suggest he had timed it carefully. He asked, without being asked, how her mother's treatments were progressing, and listened to the answers longer than politeness required, longer than the contract demanded of either of them. One evening she found him standing at the window of the penthouse long after midnight, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, staring out at the city with an expression she had not seen on him before, something closer to grief than the controlled distance he usually wore like armor. "You should be asleep," she said, stepping into the room cautiously, unsure whether her presence would be welcomed or resented. "I don't sleep well in this apartment. Never have." "Why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, the silence stretching until it became its own kind of confession. "My father died 3 floors below this one. Heart attack, alone at his desk, while everyone assumed he was simply working late. I found him the next morning. I was 22. I inherited the company the same week I buried him, and I promised myself I would never let anyone get close enough to leave a mark like that again." Adaeze crossed the room and sat on the arm of the chair nearest him, not quite touching him, but no longer maintaining the careful distance the contract implied, close enough that she could feel the tension radiating off him like heat from a stove left on too long. "That's a heavy promise to carry alone. It's the only one that's kept me standing. Grief doesn't need company to be survived, but it helps." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made the practiced coldness in his eyes falter for the first time since she had known him. "You're not what I expected when I wrote that check." "Neither are you," she admitted, surprising herself with how easily the words left her, how little she had to search for them. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them, but something had shifted in the room, something neither was ready to name aloud, something that felt fragile enough to break if either of them pushed too hard too soon. Adaeze returned to her own room that night carrying a warmth she had not expected to feel toward a man she had agreed to marry for reasons that had nothing to do with warmth at all. And she lay awake far longer than usual, turning the evening over in her mind like a coin she could not decide whether to spend. Not everyone welcomed the sudden marriage, and the ones who resented it most made certain their resentment reached Adaeze eventually, in one form or another. Priscilla Hargrove, daughter of one of Marcus's longtime business partners, had spent the better part of 2 years assuming her own eventual marriage to Marcus was simply a matter of time and patience, a certainty she had built her entire social calendar around without ever once considering it might collapse. She arrived at the office 3 weeks into the arrangement, uninvited and unannounced, her heels striking the marble floor with the confidence of a woman who had never once been told no, and had no intention of hearing it now. "This is absurd," Priscilla said, cornering Adaeze near the executive elevator before Marcus even knew she had arrived, her voice pitched low but sharp enough to cut. "A housekeeper. Marcus Whitfield married a housekeeper. Do you understand what you've stumbled into, or are you simply enjoying the money while it lasts?" "I understand exactly what I agreed to," Adaeze said evenly, refusing to let her voice shake despite the tightness gathering in her chest. "I'd appreciate it if you'd let me pass." "You won't last. Women like you never do. The moment his grandmother's gathering fades from memory, he'll remember exactly what you are, and he'll send you back to whatever you came from." The words found their target despite Adaeze's best effort to remain unaffected, echoing every fear she had carried since signing the contract, every quiet doubt she had refused to speak aloud to anyone, including herself. She said nothing further, simply stepped around Priscilla and continued toward the elevator, refusing to let the woman see how deeply the insult had landed, though the sting followed her through the rest of the afternoon like a shadow she could not quite shake loose. Marcus found out about the confrontation before the day ended, his assistant recounting the scene with more detail than Adaeze would have preferred anyone to witness, let alone repeat. He found Adaeze in the penthouse kitchen that evening, arms crossed, jaw set in a way that suggested a temper she rarely saw directed at anyone but herself, a temper that had clearly been simmering since the moment he first heard what had happened. "Priscilla had no right to speak to you that way," he said. "She's not entirely wrong. I am a housekeeper, Marcus. That's what I am." "You're my wife," he said, the word landing with more weight than either of them expected, more weight than either of them had allowed the word to carry until that exact moment. "Contract or not, in this house and in front of anyone who thinks they can speak to you like that, you're my wife, and I won't have it questioned again." 2 months into the arrangement, Adaeze's mother took a turn for the worse, and the call came at 3 in the morning the way bad news always seemed to arrive, cutting through sleep like a blade through thin fabric. The night nurse explained in careful, measured tones that her fever had spiked, and her body was struggling to fight the infection that had settled into her lungs, an infection the doctors had hoped the treatment would prevent entirely. Adaeze was dressed and in the car before she fully registered moving, Marcus beside her without having been asked to come, driving faster than the city's speed limits allowed, while she gripped the door handle and prayed in a language she had not used since childhood, the words returning to her tongue as though they had never left. The hospital hallway smelled of antiseptic and fear in equal measure, a combination Adaeze had grown far too familiar with over the past year. She sat beside her mother's bed for 6 hours, holding a hand too weak to hold hers back, while Marcus stood in the doorway at first, uncertain of his place in a moment so private, then eventually pulled a chair beside her without a word, staying through every hour of the vigil despite having a company to run and meetings he canceled without explanation to anyone who asked. When the fever finally broke near dawn, Adaeze wept in a way she had not allowed herself to weep in years, and Marcus, without hesitation, pulled her into his arms and let her ruin his shirt with tears she had been saving for a private moment that never seemed to arrive on its own. Neither of them spoke about what the embrace meant. Neither of them needed to, the silence between them saying far more than either was prepared to put into words while exhaustion still gripped them both. "Thank you," she whispered eventually, pulling back enough to look at him, her eyes swollen and raw. "For being here, you didn't have to stay." "I wanted to," he said simply. "I don't know when that stopped being about the contract and started being about you, but it did, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise anymore." The confession hung in the hospital hallway between them, fragile and unfamiliar, and Adaeze understood, standing there in the pale light of early morning, that whatever this had started as, it had already become something else entirely, something neither of them had planned for and neither of them now wanted to walk away from. But not every shadow following Adaeze through those months belonged to Priscilla, and not every threat announced itself with heels striking marble floors. There were smaller things too, things Adaeze noticed only in hindsight, the kind of details a person collects without realizing they are building towards something larger. A missing set of files from the accounting office that no one could explain. A former employee, dismissed years earlier under circumstances no one discussed openly, seen more than once in the lobby long after his access badge should have been revoked. Whispers among the staff about a woman who once worked closely with Marcus's father, a woman whose name disappeared from company records the same year his father died, as though someone had gone to considerable trouble to erase her from the story entirely. Adaeze mentioned it once to Marcus, cautiously, unsure whether raising the subject would sound like paranoia or genuine concern. He grew quiet in a way that told her the subject was not new to him, that some part of him had been circling the same unanswered questions for years without finding the courage to chase them fully. "My father's death was investigated," he said eventually. "Ruled natural causes, heart failure. I never questioned it, because questioning it felt like inviting a version of the story I wasn't ready to live inside. And now I'm starting to wonder if I stopped questioning it because someone wanted me to stop." The admission settled over the room like a weight neither of them had invited, and Adaeze found herself watching the hallways of the 40th floor differently after that conversation, aware, for the first time, that the quiet of that penthouse might not be as empty as it seemed. Eleanor Whitfield passed peacefully in her sleep 4 months into the arrangement, 3 weeks shy of the contract's original end date, her passing gentle in a way that felt almost like a final gift to a family that had spent so long bracing for something harder. The funeral drew hundreds, business partners and distant relatives and old friends who had known the family for decades, all of them watching Marcus with the particular scrutiny reserved for men who inherit both grief and fortune in the same devastating week. The reading of the will took place 5 days later in a lawyer's office lined with dark wood and portraits of Whitfields long since passed, their painted eyes seeming to watch the proceedings with the same careful attention as the living relatives gathered beneath them. Adaeze sat beside Marcus, uncertain whether her presence was appropriate given the circumstances of their arrangement, but he had insisted, his hand finding hers under the table the moment the lawyer began to speak, as though he needed the anchor of her hand more than he needed to appear composed in front of relatives who had never once offered him the same comfort. The will proceeded through the expected bequests, properties and investments distributed among relatives according to decades of careful planning. Each name read aloud met with the appropriate mixture of gratitude and quiet disappointment from those seated around the table. Then the lawyer paused, adjusting his glasses before continuing, and something in the room seemed to hold its breath along with him. "To Adaeze, my grandson's wife," he read, "I leave the sum of $2 million, along with the family's lake house in Vermont, on the condition that she use both to build the life she deserves, whether or not that life includes my grandson. I watched the way he looked at her in the final months of my life, and I have never seen him more himself. Whatever arrangement brought them together, I pray it becomes something real, because that boy has spent far too long believing love is a transaction rather than a gift." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that carries more weight than any words that might have followed it, every relative at the table suddenly aware they were witnessing something far more intimate than a legal formality. Marcus's hand tightened around Adaeze, his knuckles pale, his jaw working against emotion he rarely allowed anyone to witness, let alone an entire room of extended family. Adaeze felt tears gather that she could not entirely explain, grief for a woman who had shown her more warmth in 4 months than most people offered in years. And something else too, A recognition that the woman had seen something between them long before either of them had been willing to name it themselves, something she had chosen to bless with her final act rather than leave to chance. Marcus excused himself briefly after the reading concluded, and when he returned, his eyes were red in a way he did not attempt to hide from the relatives still gathered in the room. That night in the quiet of the penthouse, Marcus poured 2 glasses of wine and set one in front of Adaeze without a word, sitting across from her at the kitchen island in a silence that felt different from every silence that had come before it, heavier and yet somehow more open at the same time. "The contract ends in 3 weeks, he said finally, his voice steady despite the weight behind the sentence. "I know. I don't want it to." Adaeze's breath caught, the words landing somewhere between her ribs and settling there like a stone dropped into calm water. "Marcus, let me finish, because if I don't say this now, I'm not sure I'll find the nerve again." He set his glass down, turning it slowly between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the wine rather than on her, as though looking at her while speaking might have made the confession impossible to complete. "I married you because my grandmother wanted a wedding before she died, and I thought that was the whole of it. I thought I was buying myself 6 months of peace and giving you enough money to save your mother. I didn't expect to fall in love with the woman I married for convenience." He finally looked up, his eyes carrying an honesty Adaeze had not seen from him before, not even in the hospital hallway, not even at the window that night he told her about his father. "I didn't expect to spend every night in that hospital hallway thinking about how empty my life would feel without you in it. I don't want a contract anymore. I want a marriage. A real one, if you'll have me." Adaeze studied his face, searching for the calculation she had once assumed lived behind every word he spoke, and found none. Only a man tired of pretending indifference protected him from the very thing his grandmother had warned him never to let go. "I need you to understand something," Adaeze said carefully, choosing her words the way she once chose which bills to pay first, with a caution born of having too little room for error. "I didn't marry you for money either, not by the end. Somewhere between the towels and the hospital and your grandmother's hand on mine at that gathering, I stopped counting the months until this ended, and I started dreading the day it would. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." He crossed the small distance between them and kissed her the way he had wanted to for weeks, careful at first and then not careful at all, both of them finally allowing the truth neither had dared to name aloud since the night she folded towels in a stranger's bathroom, and discovered the man behind the reputation was far more complicated than the whispers had ever suggested he could be. But even as the penthouse settled into a quiet Adaeze had not felt in months, the unease she carried about the missing files and the erased employee refused to fully disappear, sitting at the edge of her happiness like a shadow waiting patiently for its moment. She began, without telling Marcus, to ask careful questions of the longest-serving staff members, the ones who had worked in the hotel long enough to remember the years before his father's death, the ones who might still remember the name of the woman who had vanished from the records the same year the family lost its patriarch. Most gave vague answers, uncomfortable in a way that suggested memory rather than ignorance, as though the subject itself had been quietly discouraged for years without anyone needing to say so aloud. One woman older, close to retirement, finally spoke to Adaeze in the laundry room one evening after the rest of the staff had gone home, her voice barely above a whisper despite the empty hallway around them. Her name was Clara, the woman said. She managed the accounts for Whitfield Sr., smart woman. Too smart, some people said, for a man who didn't like being questioned by anyone, especially not by someone he'd trusted enough to see the real numbers. What happened to her? She left the week before he died. Some said she was fired. Some said she quit. I never believed either version, not really, because Clara wasn't the kind of woman who left a fight halfway finished, not for any reason I could think of. Adaeze carried that name home with her that night, turning it over in her mind the way she once turned over hospital bills, searching for a pattern that might explain the weight it carried. She did not tell Marcus immediately, unsure whether the timing was right, unsure whether raising his father's death again so soon after burying his grandmother would reopen wounds that deserved, at least for a little while, to be left alone. Instead, she quietly began searching through old records herself, late at night after Marcus had fallen asleep, piecing together fragments of a story that seemed increasingly deliberate in the way certain names and dates had been scrubbed from company files, as though someone had gone to considerable effort to make sure Clara's presence in that building was forgotten entirely. Not everyone accepted the news of the renewed marriage gracefully, and Priscilla, having watched her plans dissolve in real time, arrived at Marcus's office one final time with a folder of documents she claimed proved Adaeze had orchestrated the entire arrangement from the beginning, fabricated financial records suggesting Adaeze had researched Marcus's net worth months before their first meeting in the hotel suite. A claim so carefully constructed it might have fooled someone less familiar with the actual timeline of events. Marcus barely glanced at the papers before sliding them back across his desk, his expression unreadable in the way it became whenever he had already decided a matter was settled before it was even fully presented to him. "I had these accounts audited the week we signed the contract, Priscilla. Every transaction, every record. There's nothing here that wasn't already reviewed by people far more qualified than you to find it. You'd believe her over me. I'd believe evidence over jealousy, and that's what this is. I think it's time you left, and I'd advise against contacting either of us again." Priscilla left without another word, the folder of fabricated evidence still in her hands, her final attempt at unraveling the marriage collapsing as quickly as it had begun, though Adaeze, watching from the doorway, could not shake the feeling that Priscilla's failed accusation had been a distraction from something else entirely, something she still did not fully understand. That suspicion proved correct sooner than Adaeze expected. A week after Priscilla's confrontation, Marcus's longtime accountant, a quiet man named Reginald who had served the family for nearly 20 years, requested an urgent meeting with Marcus alone, his voice on the phone tight with a nervousness the staff rarely heard from him. Adaeze was not present for that meeting, but Marcus emerged from his office afterward pale in a way she had never seen on him before, not even in the days following his grandmother's funeral. He told her that evening, sitting once again at the kitchen island where he had once confessed his feelings for her, that Reginald had uncovered irregularities in a set of accounts dating back nearly a decade, irregularities that traced, unmistakably, to the final months before his father's death. "Clara wasn't fired," Marcus said quietly, the name landing between them though Adaeze had never once mentioned it to him. "How do you know that name?" Adaeze asked, startled. "Because Reginald found her final report before it disappeared from the system. She discovered someone was moving money out of the company through shell accounts, and she brought it to my father the week before he died. My father confronted someone about it. And 3 days later, he was dead at his desk, and everyone called it a heart attack, and nobody ever looked twice at the timeline, because grief has a way of making people stop asking the questions that matter most." The suspense that had quietly gathered around them for weeks suddenly sharpened into something far more dangerous than either of them had allowed themselves to imagine. Reginald had traced the shell accounts as far as he could before the trail went cold, but one name kept surfacing in the older records, a name belonging to a man who had once served as the company's head of security under Marcus's father, a man dismissed shortly after the funeral under circumstances the board had never fully explained. Adaeze remembered, with a chill that settled deep in her chest, the former employee she had noticed lingering in the lobby months earlier, his access badge long since revoked, yet his presence never quite fully gone from the building's periphery. She described him to Marcus in careful detail, and his expression confirmed what she had already begun to suspect, that the man in the lobby and the name in Reginald's report were one and the same person, still circling the company he had once nearly destroyed. Marcus hired a private investigator that same week, a woman recommended by Reginald with a reputation for discretion the family valued above nearly everything else. Within days, she confirmed that the former head of security, a man named Dale Corwin, had maintained quiet contact with several members of the extended family since his dismissal, including, troublingly, a cousin of Marcus's who had long resented being passed over for a leadership role within the company. The investigators' report suggested Corwin had never stopped believing there was more money to extract from the Whitfield fortune, and that Clara's discovery all those years earlier had threatened an arrangement he had spent years quietly building beneath the company's surface, an arrangement that had apparently resumed the moment Marcus's grandmother passed and the estate began its transfer of assets. Adaeze found herself watching the penthouse hallways differently after that report, aware for the first time that the quiet comfort she had built with Marcus existed alongside a danger that had never actually gone away, only waited patiently in the years since his father's death for another opportunity to surface. She said as much to Marcus one night, unable to fully shake the unease that had settled over her since learning Corwin's name, and he pulled her close in a way that felt less like comfort and more like a promise. "Whatever this becomes," he said, "you won't face it without me, not for a single day of it." The words steadied her more than she expected, though the unease did not fully disappear, only shifted into something she now carried alongside him rather than alone. The investigators' final report arrived 3 weeks later, delivered personally rather than by mail, given the sensitivity of what it contained. Dale Corwin had indeed orchestrated the original scheme that Clara uncovered, moving funds through a series of shell companies registered under names borrowed from long-dissolved businesses, a scheme sophisticated enough to survive undetected for years precisely, because no one had thought to question a man the family trusted so completely. The confrontation between Corwin and Marcus's father, the report suggested, had grown heated enough that a witness, a night security guard long since retired, recalled hearing raised voices from the executive floor the evening before Marcus's father was found dead at his desk, a detail that had never made its way into any official investigation at the time. Marcus took the report to the authorities that same week, alongside Reginald's financial documentation and the investigators' careful timeline, setting in motion an inquiry that would take months to fully resolve, but that finally gave Marcus something he had not realized he was missing for nearly a decade: the possibility of an answer rather than an assumption about how his father had truly died. Corwin was arrested within days, the cousin who had maintained contact with him quietly distancing himself from the family in the weeks that followed, his own involvement limited enough, the investigators concluded, to avoid formal charges but severe enough to end whatever standing he still held within the extended family. Clara, it turned out, had not disappeared the way the old record suggested. The investigator located her living quietly 2 states away, having left the company under pressure she had never fully understood herself, until Marcus reached out personally to apologize for a debt of gratitude the family had owed her for far too long. She agreed to meet with him, and the conversation that followed gave Marcus something closer to peace than he had felt in the decades since his father's funeral, a confirmation that the woman who tried to protect the company had not vanished out of guilt or wrongdoing, only out of fear for her own safety. Once, she realized how far Corwin's reach extended within the organization she had once trusted completely. With the truth finally settled, and the danger that had quietly shadowed their early months together fully resolved, Adaeze and Marcus found themselves able, for the first time since the contract began, to build a life together without the weight of unanswered questions hanging over every quiet evening in the penthouse. 6 months after Corwin's arrest, they renewed their vows in a small ceremony at the Vermont Lake house Billionaire had left them, surrounded by the few people who mattered most rather than the hundreds who had attended their first wedding out of obligation. Adaeze's mother, fully recovered, sat in the front row in a wheelchair she insisted she no longer needed but used out of caution, tears streaming freely as her daughter walked toward a man who had once offered her a check to disappear, and now offered her an entire life instead. "I used to believe love was something people used to control each other," Marcus said during his vows, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I watched my father work himself into an early grave believing success mattered more than connection, and for years I believed his death was simply the price of ambition, a debt owed to a life spent building something larger than himself. I know now it was something else entirely, something stolen from him by people who never deserved the trust he gave them. You walked into my life carrying nothing but exhaustion and dignity, and you taught me that the two aren't mutually exclusive, that a person can be desperate and still refuse to be diminished. I love you, Adaeze. Not the woman I married on paper, but the woman who stayed, and who helped me finally understand the truth I had spent a decade too afraid to chase." Adaeze, her own voice trembling, took his hands in hers. "I signed a contract because I was drowning, and I told myself it would only ever be paperwork. But you sat beside my mother's hospital bed at 3 in the morning without being asked. You let your grandmother's dying wish become the reason you finally let someone in. You taught me that dignity doesn't disappear just because circumstances force a person into rooms they never wanted to enter. I love you too, Marcus. Not for what you gave me, but for who you became willing to be, and for trusting me enough to chase the truth about your father even when it would have been easier to leave the past exactly where it was." The lake reflected the late afternoon sun as the small gathering applauded, and somewhere in the quiet space between vows spoken twice, and a love that had grown from desperation into something neither of them had dared to imagine, two people who once stood on opposite sides of a folded towel found themselves exactly where they belonged, no longer haunted by questions neither of them had been brave enough to ask before that arrangement first brought them together. A year later, Adaeze stood in the kitchen of the Vermont house, watching her mother teach Marcus how to properly season a pot of stew neither of them had grown up eating, but both had come to love. The kitchen filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove, and everything to do with the people gathered around it. Outside, snow fell softly over the lake, and somewhere in the house, a nursery sat freshly painted, waiting for news Adaeze had not yet shared with anyone but the doctor who confirmed it that morning, a secret she planned to reveal that same evening once dinner had settled and the house had grown quiet again. She thought sometimes about the girl who had counted $300 in a cleaning closet, certain the number would never be enough, never imagining that the same hallway leading to Suite 4001 would eventually lead her home, that the same building where she once feared losing everything would become the place where she finally found it. Dignity, she had learned, was never about the uniform a person wore or the debts they carried. It was about refusing to let either define what they truly deserved, and about trusting, even in the darkest months, that the truth would eventually find its way into the light. Marcus caught her watching from the doorway and crossed the kitchen to press a kiss against her temple, his hand finding hers the way it always did now, without hesitation, without contract, without anything standing between them but the life they had chosen together, deliberately, with open eyes and full understanding of everything it had cost them to arrive there. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How far we've come from a folded towel." He laughed, the sound easy in a way it had never been in that first cold suite, a sound that no longer carried the weight of grief he had once mistaken for strength. "Best towel I ever bought," he said, and Adaeze, laughing along with him, finally allowed herself to believe that the life they had built together was as safe and as real as it felt in that quiet, snow-covered kitchen. If this story moved you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.